Alright, in this video, we'll learn how to build yet another to-do list application using Ruby on Rails and the new Hotwire framework from Basecamp. We'll start with a new Rails app from scratch and learn about Hotwire and Stimulus as we build our app. Now I'm also going to use Tailwind to style our application, but it's not a requirement and the code examples should still work without it. But if you haven't worked with Tailwind before, I highly recommend that you give it a try. Before we start coding, this is a quick preview of what we are going to build. As you can see, it's a simple CRUD application. You can add new tasks. You can edit the existing tasks. You can mark it as complete, and you can also delete it. So let's start coding now. For this tutorial, I'll assume that you have installed the required dependencies for building a Rails application. If not, just follow the Getting Started guide on Rails documentation and you should be all set. You can find it by searching for Rails Getting Started. Specifically, follow the third step, which shows you how to create a new Rails project and the dependencies you need to install. With that out of the way, let's start by creating a new Rails app. So let's open a new terminal window and create our project. You can see Rails has created a project folder called Task Manager. Let's switch into that. Now open the project in your favorite editor. I'm going to use RubyMine. And just to make sure everything is set up properly, let's start the server. And I get an error because I already have another app running, so let's stop that. And let's try again. All right, so let's go to localhost 3000 and yay, we are greeted with a Rails logo. And that means everything is set up properly and we can start coding. Next, we will install Tailwind. Now you could totally build this application without using Tailwind just using plain CSS or a framework like Bootstrap. But I've really gotten fond of Tailwind since I started learning it a few months ago and like to use it in all my projects. It's totally fine if you don't want to use it, and the rest of the tutorial should still work for you, so just skip this step. But yeah, let's go ahead and install Tailwind if you're interested in trying that. So let's go to our project directory, and if you haven't seen Tailwind, by the way, so go to tailwindcss.com, and it's a CSS framework. It's a utility first framework, so you use, instead of writing your style in the style sheet file, use Tailwind's utility classes. So to install Tailwind in your Rails application, we are going to use the Tailwind CSS Rails gem. So you can install that using this command: bundle add Tailwind CSS -Rails. So this adds the Tailwind CSS Rails gem to your project. Next, we will run the Tailwind installer, which sets up Tailwind for you, additionally setting up the foreman, which makes running Tailwind and your Rails application very easy. So let's do that. All right, so let's see what we have so far. So the installer created a tailwind.config.js file, which so Tailwind watches these files to generate the final CSS, and Tailwind CSS Rails gem automatically set up everything for us, so we don't have to change anything. And another nice thing that it does is it adds this proc file with the following commands to launch our server and to launch the Tailwind CLI, and it writes this dev script in the bin directory, which starts foreman, so we don't have to start these processes separately. So to try it out, let's go back to our terminal where we have the application running, stop the application, and let's run a new command called bin dev. And you can see it started the web process, which is the Rails server, and the CSS process, which is the Tailwind CLI, and it has completed both. And we will go back to our application and reload the page, and nothing changed. That means everything is working. Next, we'll create a resource to hold our tasks. A resource is any object that users can access via URL and perform CRUD operations on. So let's create our task resource. And it has a description, which is of type string, and let's put a limit of 200 characters on it. And it also has a property called completed, which is a boolean. This tells us whether a task is completed or not. Let's run the command, and it generates the following files. Let's open the project in editors to review the files that it created for us. The first file is it added a new migration for us. This migration creates a table tasks with description and completed attributes. To create this table in the database, we will run the db migrate command. So in the terminal, type bin rails db:migrate. So it created the tasks table. We can check if the table is created by connecting, by opening the database in a browser. You can use a UI tool like DB browser. I'm just going to use the RubyMines inbuilt database viewer. And the database file should be in the DB directory. Of your project. And here's the tasks table. You can see it has a description and a completed attributes. And Rails adds the created at and updated at attributes automatically. So our database is now set up. Next, let's check out the routes file, and you can see the generate resource command has added a new resource for us. We'll update this file by adding a root directive. This tells Rails to take the user to the task index action whenever they visit the home page. Now, if we save this and restart our server and go to the localhost 3000, we'll get an error that says the index The action index could not be found for tasks controller, because even though we tell Rails to use this tasks controller and index action, we haven't actually added that. So let's go ahead and create the index action, which loads the tasks from the database. We don't have any right now, but whenever the user goes to homepage, we want to grab all the tasks from the database and display them. So that's what this method is doing here. So if we go back and reload the page, we get another error saying no template for interactive request. But this is happening because we haven't created a view template for us yet. So let's create that. In here, we'll just add a h1 tag to display the words task manager with a few Tailwind classes. So if we save that and reload the page, we'll have the task manager header here. And this also tells us that Tailwind is set up properly. Now a task manager without any tasks is boring. So let's add a form using which the users can add new tasks. So let's start by creating a new task in the index action on our tasks controller. And our form will use this task as the default task. Next, let's create our form partial by adding a form file in the app views tasks directory. It's going to be a partial because we will reuse that when we add the form to edit the tasks. So let's create this file. Any view file that starts with an underscore is a partial that can be reused in different view templates. And in here, we'll use this code. So it's using the form with helper, and we are using this task that we just created as the model. And here we have a text field for the task description, and we have a button to save the task. Finally, in the index file, let's use that partial that we just created. So what we are doing here is we have the task controller and we have the index file. In the index action, we create a new task, and in the view, we are passing that task to the form partial. And the form partial uses that task as the model and shows its description and has a save button. All right, so let's reload the page, and there we have our form to add a new task, but the button doesn't look good. So let's just add a button class in our application CSS file. In here, just uncomment this code and replace this button primary with this button. So what we are doing here is we are using the apply directive of Tailwind, which basically creates a new class, and whenever we use this class, all these Tailwind utility classes get applied on that element. So what we are doing here is we are adding some margin at the top, we're making our button rounded, some padding, it's going to be an inline block element, the font size is medium, and we also want to display the pointer when we hover over it. So let's save that and just make sure we have our button class on the form. Yes, here. So this button will get these styles. So let's save that and reload the page, and you can see our save button looks much nicer now. Now if you add some text here and hit save, the page simply reloads. But if you inspect the dev tools in the networks tab, let's try that again. You should see an error here. That's because even though we are submitting the form, we haven't added the code in the backend that's supposed to handle this post request on the tasks endpoint. So let's add that. Now by convention, whenever we make a post request to tasks, Rails looks for a create action, and we can verify that by checking the routes. So let's run the command bin Rails routes, and we're also gonna grep it on tasks. So you can see the post request on the tasks endpoint expects a create action on the tasks controller. So let's create that action. In the tasks controller.ruby file, let's add a create action, and in here we are going to create another instance variable, and we are going to create a new task using the params object. But we are not going to use the params object as it is. Instead, we are going to create a task params method, which is a private method, and it's going to sanitize the params hash by requiring that it has a task attribute and only permitting the description on it. And we are going to use that here. Now you might wonder why we are using task params instead of fetching them directly from the params hash. Now this technique allows you to choose which attributes should be permitted for updates, and it prevents accidentally exposing the attributes which should not be exposed. So require method marks parameters as required, and permit is used to set the parameters as permitted and limit which attributes should be allowed for mass updating. So now that we have created a task in memory from the params, the next step is to save that task. So what we are going to do here is we are going to use the respond to format, and in here I'm just going to paste some code instead of typing it out. So we need to save the task. So first we create a task and then we save the task, and if it saves without any errors, we redirect to the tasks URL. Now this is just a helper path and it points to the tasks endpoint. And we also set the notice saying that task was successfully created. And to show that task, we need to update the index layout, index template, and let's first display our notice. So above the task manager, let's add this code here. So basically we are checking if the notice is present, and if it is, then we are adding this paragraph with the bunch of Tailwind styles, a little bit of padding, background green, bottom margin, text, green text. So that it's simply showing a notice. And then we need to show the tasks, but let's see what we have so far. Let's reload the page and let's add a new task. And we can see that our notice shows up successfully and the task has been saved in the database, but it's not showing up yet in the home page. So let's fix that. it's not showing up because we haven't added any code on the view template to display the tasks. So let's fix that by adding the following code. We're going to create a new div with the ID of tasks. In here, let's add a header saying tasks, and let's add a few styles. Make it font bold, large text, and a bit of margin at the bottom. And then we are going to add another div with a bit of padding, and we are going to render our tasks. Now this is a bit of Rails shortcut to render the task partial. When we pass the tasks like this, it basically loops over each task and then renders a partial called task. So let's add the task partial. And this is going to be a very simple partial, simple div with a bit of padding, and in here we are going to simply display the task description. That's it. Now let's go to the browser and reload the page, and there is our task. So let's add another task. And we can see that it's creating our tasks and displaying them here. At this point, some of you might be wondering, hey, you said we are going to use Hotwire in this tutorial. When are we going to get to that part? If so, I have a surprise for you. We're already using Hotwire, at least a sub-framework of it called Turbo Drive, which is activated by default in a Rails 7 app. So notice that the browser is not doing a full page reload when we add a new task. For example, if I add a task and hit save, you can see the browser didn't load. Let's try it again. Keep an eye on this Rails logo. So the application feels very responsive, but if we check our controller, we can see that upon a successful submission of a task, we are redirecting to the home page. So the browser should be reloading the page. The reason it's not reloading the page and it feels so fast and responsive is because Turbo Drive is running behind the scenes to make your app feels much more responsive and giving it a single page application like feel. So how's that work? So whenever you click a link or submit a form, Turbo Drive intercepts all clicks and form submissions, and it prevents the browser from following that link or form submission. So it stops browser from reloading, and basically it changes the browser URL using the history API, and then it requests the new page. If it's a link, it requests the new page using a fetch request, and if it's a form submission, similarly makes a post request. Then it gets the response from the server, and instead of reloading the browser to show the new page, it replaces the current body element of the existing HTML with the response body HTML, and it also merges the head element content. And the JavaScript window and document objects and the HTML elements stay the same from one rendering to the next. And as a result, the app feels much faster and responsive. To see how the app will behave without Hotwire, let's disable the Turbo Drive framework by setting a property to false in the application.js file. So let's open the application.js file. It's in the JavaScript directory, and let's add turbo.session.drive equals false. Now if we reload the page and try to add a new task, keep an eye on the Rails logo. You could see the browser did a full reload here. Let's try that again. You can see it's reloading for each submission. Let's remove that and reload the page. Keep an eye on the logo. You can see it's not doing a full page reload. That's because the turbo drive is intercepting the response HTML and just replacing the existing body with the response body, so app feels much faster. Now you must have noticed that there is no way to complete our tasks. What fun is there to keep piling more and more work without having a way to complete them? We need a checkbox that will mark a task as complete or incomplete. And for this, we'll use another Hotwire framework called Stimulus. It's a modest JavaScript framework for the HTML you already have. And I like the way it describes here. So it doesn't try to do too much, and it just works with your HTML to add enough behavior to make it shine. And the way Stimulus works is basically in your HTML, you add these data controller attributes. And whatever the value you give here, Stimulus looks for a file with the same name. So if you have hello, it will look for hello controller.js and instantiate a controller object that you created here. And it will connect the element on which you added that data controller attribute, and it will connect that element to this controller object. And you have access to that element in here. So we'll use Stimulus to talk to the backend whenever a user clicks or unclicks a checkbox. We'll make a fetch request to the server and to mark a task as complete or incomplete, and get a response from the server and show it as an alert. So let's start by adding a checkbox next to the task description. Because we are rendering the task as a partial, we'll add our checkbox here. So let's replace this with HTML with our new code. And what we're doing here is, because we need a checkbox, we're wrapping the description in a form with tag. And we are using the form.checkbox helper. And it's using the completed attribute on the task. And we just added a few Tailwind styles to make the task checkbox look good. And if we save this and reload the page, you can see that it's now have that checkbox next to the task description. Next, we'll add a data controller attribute in our index template. Why are we adding data controller here? Because this is where we have the parent div that is rendering all the tasks. And we are going to add a data controller equals tasks attribute here. And the reason we do this is because in Stimulus, we mark our elements of interest by annotating their data attributes. So once we have that, the next step is to add a tasks controller JavaScript file, which we are going to add in here in the JavaScript directory and under the controllers directory. You can see Rails already provides a example file, hello controller.js, and we are going to add a similar file called tasks controller.js. And let's just copy the existing code here And what it does is it imports the controller class from the stimulus library, and here we create our own class that extends from the controller. And connect method is a method that gets fired whenever the element gets connected to the controller. So basically the way stimulus works is continuously running behind the scenes, and whenever it comes across this data controller attribute, it tries to find the tasks controller file, finds the controller, instantiates that controller, and connects that element to the controller, and then it fires the connect method. So let's just log something here just to make sure it's working. And we have access to that element here. So this development will be, we have access to that here. So with that setup, let's open DevTools and open the console tab, and let's reload the page. And you can see it logged our dev element, which has the data controller tasks attribute. Next, we want to make a backend request whenever the user clicks this checkbox. For this, we are going to update our checkbox in the task partial by adding data attributes on it, similar to data controller. And this time we are going to use two attributes, one called ID, and we are just going to pass the task ID here. And we are also going to use a action attribute, and in here we'll use this string. Now I'll explain you what this does in a minute. So let's just see what HTML gets rendered when we reload the page. So if we inspect the checkbox, you can see it has the input checkbox has data ID equals 1 and data action equals tasks hash toggle. So first, the data ID attribute, the reason we are using this is it's not specific to stimulus, but we are using it to pass the task ID to the controller so we can pass it to the server. We'll get back to it when we write the JavaScript code. But just remember that we are using this attribute to pass the task ID to the stimulus controller. And the action is data action attribute is specific to stimulus, and it tells stimulus that whenever a user clicks on this checkbox, call the toggle method defined on the controller in the tasks controller JS file. So stimulus will expect that our tasks controller has a toggle method. So let's add that, and here we'll just alert to make to verify if it's calling that method. So let's save that and reload the page. And if I click checkbox, it shows the alert you clicked the checkbox, and you can click any checkbox and it calls that method. All right, so with that, now that our HTML and the JavaScript is connected, the next step is to make a fetch request to the backend server and pass this task ID and whether they selected or unselected the checkbox information to the server. So we're going to use I'll just paste some code that I have here, and we'll go over it. So first you can see I'm fetching the ID from the event. So E is the event, and stimulus passes that click event to the function. So we have access to E, and we are fetching the ID from the e.target.dataset.id. So event has a target property which has dataset, and it has an ID that we set earlier in the ID attribute. So just to keep things simple, I'll just comment this for a second, and let's reload the page, and let's put a breakpoint on this line here, and let's click this. So you can see stimulus passes the click event to our toggle function. It has a target, which refers to that checkbox element. It has data set, which is a map of all the data attributes we have, and in here we have id equals 1. So that's how we are getting the id here. All right, so let's uncomment this, and what we're doing here is we're using the id in the URL to which we are making this fetch request. The method is post because we are submitting data, and the rest of the values are just a standard fetch request values for a post. And we pass the data whether the user checked or unchecked the checkbox in the body attribute. And so this is making a post request to the backend. Now it's making a request to the tasks ID toggle endpoint, but we haven't configured our routes file to listen on this endpoint. So let's do that now. Open the routes file. In here, let's add a new route for post request, and it's going to be on toggle endpoint, and it will call the tasks toggle method. All right, so with that set up now, let's one thing that's missing is we don't have an action toggle on the controller, so I'll add that now. Here we'll just create the task instance variable, and we are going to first find that task from the database using the ID that we just passed in the URL, and then we are going to update that task with its completed property set to whatever we passed in the body params completed. And finally we are going to render JSON response with a message that is set to success. All right, now we are all set. Let's save everything and reload the page. If I open the tasks controller, and let's put a breakpoint here. Let's click a checkbox and success. So that means after we clicked this checkbox, the stimulus controller made a fetch request to the server, which sent a response, and we displayed that response. So let's click another checkbox and we get another success. Now let's reload the page, and we can see the values were saved in the database. That's great. The last step will allow the users to edit and delete the tasks. So let's start by adding the corresponding actions. Now this is just going to be standard Rails stuff, Rails CRUD code, so I won't go too deep into it. So let's just paste some code that I have copied. So we have an edit action, we have an update action, and we have a destroy action. So whenever you click the edit button, we will find the task, and then we'll render the edit view template. And whenever after they make the change and hit save, it will call the update action, where we find the task from the database and update the task using the task parameters, and then we redirect to the home page. And finally, when you click the delete button, it hits the destroy endpoint action, and it just finds the task from the params hash and deletes that task and redirects to the home page again. So that's the controller part. Now let's add the corresponding views in the views tasks directory. First we'll add the edit template. So Let's create the edit.html.erb file, and in here I'll just paste this code. Now I'm going to push this repository on GitHub, so you'll have access to all the code. So what this is doing is we have a header with editing task, and in here we are going to use the task that we just created here in the edit, and we are going to render the form that we created, that we had on the home page, because it was a partial. So we render the form and we just add a link to go back to the home page in case they change their mind. So we have the form now. Next, we are going to add the edit and delete buttons or links next to the task. So open the task partial, and after the form, add these two links. One of them is button for delete, and the another is link to edit, and that's it. I'll get back to this data attribute later, but let's just make sure our edit and delete buttons are working. So let's reload the page, and you can see we have edit and delete function here. If we click on the edit, it takes us to the edit page where we can make a change. Clicking save updates the task. We can also edit, and clicking nevermind takes us back to the home page. And we can delete the task, and post was successfully deleted. And I think I have a typo here where I'm using, I mean to say task, not post. Alright, so that's fixed, and let's delete another, and yeah, task was successfully deleted. Alright, so we have implemented the edit and delete features. Now let's get back to that data attribute here. So we have the data action tasks delete attribute. So again, whenever you click that button, Stimulus is going to watch for the tasks controller file, and it's going to call the tasks delete action. So let's and the reason we want to do that is just to prompt the user whether they want to really want to delete the task or not, or because we don't want to delete the task if they accidentally click the delete button. So let's add the delete method. We are going to show the confirmation dialog. Are you sure? And if they confirmed, actually if they do not confirm, then we are going to call prevent default on the event. So we are not going to call the send that request to the backend, otherwise we'll just proceed. So with that setup, let's try if that worked. So let's click delete, and it shows the confirmation, are you sure? If you click cancel, it won't delete that task, and if you click OK, it deletes that task. So that's how we can add a second level of protection before deleting the task. And that's it. So congratulations, we have just implemented a full-featured, good-looking CRUD task manager using Ruby on Rails and Hotwire frameworks. Specifically, we used the Turbo Drive and the Stimulus frameworks. I hope that was useful and you learned something new. If you liked the video, please let me know in the comments. I look forward to your feedback.